The thing about living in a quiet suburban neighborhood is that you never expect the loudest threat to come from within your own HOA. But that's exactly what happened to me, and you won't believe how far one entitled neighbor went when I refused to bow down to her outrageous demands. So before I tell you how Karen tried to have me arrested for simply refusing to pay her personal bills, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss a jaw-dropping HOA drama like this one. Because what happened in my neighborhood could happen to anyone, and you need to be ready. It all started when I came back from a work trip and found an envelope taped to my front door that wasn't just a routine notice from the HOA about lawn maintenance or holiday decorations, but an actual demand for payment, and not even for dues or fines. No. It was a list of charges for things like Karen's landscaper, Karen's pool cleaning service, and even a credit card bill she had the nerve to say was part of community beautification expenses. I thought it was some kind of joke at first. The total came to over $1,800. And as I stood there on my porch with this ridiculous letter in my hand, Karen herself came strutting across the street with that smug look she always carried like she owned the whole block. She asked if I'd seen the notice and reminded me that payments were due immediately. I laughed and told her she must be confused because none of those expenses had anything to do with me. But she flipped her hair, crossed her arms, and told me that as a member of the HOA, it was my responsibility to help cover gaps in the budget. And when I refused, she got this cold look in her eyes and muttered, "We'll see about that," before storming off. I figured she was just bluffing like she always did, trying to intimidate me into compliance. But 2 days later, I was at home on a Saturday morning, sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee, when I saw flashing lights outside my window, and when I opened the door, 2 police officers were standing there asking for me by name. I was stunned and asked what was going on. And one of them explained that there had been a 911 call reporting me for fraud and theft. My jaw hit the floor because I immediately knew who was behind it. I invited them in and showed them the absurd notice Karen had taped to my door, explaining that I had no reason, legal or otherwise, to pay her personal bills. The officers listened carefully and started realizing the whole thing smelled wrong. But just as I was clarifying the situation, Karen herself marched up to my porch, waving her phone and shouting about how I was stealing from the HOA, demanding they take me away. The cops asked her to calm down and produce documentation proving her claims. But all she had was a stack of printouts from her personal bank account and some sloppy notes about community expenses. The officers glanced at each other, and I could tell they were trying not to roll their eyes. One of them finally told her that a neighbor refusing to cover her pool cleaning was not a criminal matter, but Karen doubled down, raising her voice and accusing me of harassment, neglecting my HOA duties, and being a menace to the community. I stood there stunned at the sheer audacity. But also realizing this wasn't just a petty squabble anymore, Karen had escalated it to calling 911, which meant she was willing to drag law enforcement into her personal vendetta. And if she was capable of that, who knew what else she'd try? The officers eventually warned her about misuse of emergency services. She told me I wasn't under investigation for anything and left. But the look Karen gave me as they walked away was pure venom, like she was plotting her next move. I knew then this wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a battle that would push me to my limits and make me fight back in ways I never thought I'd have to. And it all stemmed from one: woman's greed and abuse of power in a neighborhood that was supposed to be peaceful. After the police drove off and the flashing lights disappeared from the street, I thought maybe Karen would realize she had gone too far, that maybe the embarrassment of being shut down by officers on her own doorstep would make her retreat. But I was dead wrong, because Karen was the kind of person who doubled down when she didn't get her way. And sure enough, less than 24 hours later, another notice was shoved into my mailbox. This one stamped with what looked like the HOA's official seal, but on closer inspection, I realized it was a cheap printout that Karen must have made herself. The letter accused me of being delinquent on required contributions, citing vague bylaws and threatening escalating fines, and to add insult to injury. She had copied half the neighborhood on the email version of the notice, painting me as some kind of deadbeat who refused to support the community. The emails were dripping with manipulation. She wrote things like, We can't allow selfish individuals to bankrupt our HOA. Everyone must do their part, even if it means covering temporary gaps in our budget. But I knew this wasn't about any budget gap. This was about Karen trying to offload her personal expenses onto unsuspecting neighbors, and because she sat on the HOA board. She thought she could twist the rules however she liked. Some neighbors reached out privately, saying they didn't believe her story, but were too intimidated to confront her publicly. Others, unfortunately, seemed to fall for her narrative and started giving me judgmental looks when I drove down the street. It was infuriating to be painted as the villain when all I had done was stand up for what was right. So I decided to push back with facts. I pulled out my HOA contract, highlighted the sections about dues and responsibilities, and drafted a formal letter of my own, pointing out that nowhere in the bylaws did it state I was responsible for personal expenses of other board members. I emailed it to the entire HOA distribution list, making sure every resident saw the truth in writing. And I braced myself for the backlash. Sure enough, Karen fired back within hours, accusing me of misrepresenting the law and threatening to fine me $500 for defamation against the HOA board, which was laughable since she was the one defaming me. But the scarier part came later that night when I noticed a car idling slowly past my house. Lights off, windows tinted, lingering just long enough to make me uneasy. I couldn't prove it was related to Karen, but my gut told me she was trying to intimidate me the next morning. I found a bright orange slip taped to my garage that said, "Violation, unapproved trash can storage," which was absurd because my cans were in the same spot they'd been since I moved in. Tucked neatly against the side of the house, it was clear Karen was now using her power in the HOA to target me personally. Piling on bogus violations to wear me down, I took photos of everything, documented dates and times, and started building a folder of evidence, because if she thought I was just going to roll over, she was in for a surprise. The breaking point came later that week during the monthly HOA meeting. Held in the community clubhouse, I walked in to find Karen already. At the head of the table, arms folded, papers stacked in front of her, glaring at me like she'd been rehearsing this showdown, the room was packed with neighbors. Some curious, some angry, and as soon as the meeting started, Karen launched into a tirade about irresponsible members refusing to contribute and how such behavior put the community at risk. She gestured toward me like I was on trial, but when I stood to defend myself, calmly explaining that I had no legal obligation to pay her bills and that her so-called fines were nothing but harassment, I noticed a shift in the room. A few heads started nodding in agreement, and whispers spread across the tables. People were beginning to see through her act. Karen's face reddened as she realized she was losing her grip, so she tried one last desperate play, announcing that she had already escalated the matter to authorities and that my refusal to pay was now a criminal concern. I could hardly believe she was saying this out loud, as if calling 911 over unpaid landscaping was a legitimate move. I told her plainly that abusing emergency services was itself illegal, and that I had every intention of protecting myself legally. The room grew tense, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the board members exchanging uneasy glances, and for the first time I saw Karen falter, her voice cracking just slightly as she tried to regain control. But the damage was done. People were starting to question her authority, and I walked out of that meeting determined to take the next step, because if she wanted to drag me into a fight, I was ready to fight her on every front, with evidence, with law, and with the truth. But little did I know, Karen wasn't done. Escalating, she was just getting started, and her next move would drag me into deeper conflict than I had ever imagined. After that HOA meeting, things in the neighborhood started to shift in unsettling ways, as if the air itself was charged with tension. People who had once waved when I passed by suddenly avoided eye contact. Some whispered in clusters on the sidewalks, and though a handful of neighbors quietly thanked me for standing up to Karen, most stayed silent, afraid of becoming her next target. It was obvious that her grip on the community was rooted in fear, and the more I resisted, the more determined she became to crush me. The first escalation came in the form of an official-looking letter stamped with legal language, claiming that my continued refusal to pay required contributions. It triggered additional penalties, and that the HOA would pursue lien action against my property. I knew this was a scare tactic. She couldn't legally file a lien for bills that had nothing to do with HOA dues, but the letter was worded to intimidate, and if I hadn't been paying close attention, it might have worked. I contacted a local attorney just to confirm my instincts, and he laughed when I showed him the paperwork. He's telling me flat out it was nonsense and advising me to keep documenting everything because Karen was skating dangerously close to fraud. That gave me some reassurance, but it didn't solve the immediate problem. Karen wasn't just harassing me on paper anymore. It was starting to interfere with my daily life. One morning I woke to find my car keyed along the driver's side. A deep scratch carved from the front fender to the back door, and though I couldn't prove it was Karen, the timing was suspicious. Especially since later that afternoon, I caught her standing at the end of her driveway with her arms crossed. Staring at my house with a smirk that said everything without a word, the harassment didn't stop there. Days later, I found my trash cans mysteriously tipped over and garbage scattered across my lawn. Then a neighbor mentioned they'd overheard Karen bragging about how she'd make sure I regretted messing with her. The tension came to a head when I received a knock on my door one evening just after dinner, opening it to find two different officers standing there. Informed me another 911 call had been made, this time reporting that I was threatening a board member. I nearly laughed at the absurdity, but I knew it was serious. I explained the ongoing harassment and showed them the file of evidence I had been compiling, from fake fines to bogus letters, even photos of vandalism. The officers took notes and admitted it looked like a pattern of abuse. They advised me to consider filing a harassment complaint. But before they left, Karen stormed across the street again, shouting that I was lying, waving her phone and insisting I had made threats against her. It was surreal watching her spin lie after lie. But the officers remained calm, telling her that false reporting was a crime and warning her that her behavior could land her in real trouble if she continued. Karen's face flushed bright red and she stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. After that incident, I knew I had no choice but to escalate matters legally. So the next morning I went to the county clerk's office and filed a formal complaint, attaching every piece of evidence I had collected. My attorney assured me this was the right step, because the more Karen abused her power, the more likely it was that the law would catch up with her. But the waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. Not knowing what stunt she'd pull next, at night I kept my curtains drawn tight and lights on half, expecting to find another bogus violation notice or even worse. And sure enough, during the next HOA newsletter, Karen had slipped in a full-page section warning neighbors about so-called non-compliant residents who were jeopardizing the community's reputation. Though she didn't name me directly, it was obvious who she meant because the examples she gave: refusing to pay contributions, filing frivolous complaints, disrespecting board authority, were all her twisted versions of the truth. It was a smear campaign, plain and simple. But here's the thing Karen didn't anticipate. People were starting to get tired of her antics. One by one, neighbors began emailing me copies of notices she had sent them to. Bogus violations for things like slightly faded paint on mailboxes or grass that was half an inch too long. She wasn't just targeting me, she had been running the neighborhood like her own personal kingdom for years. And now that someone was standing up to her, others were finding the courage to speak out. I realized then this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was bigger than me. Karen had created a culture of fear, and if I didn't see this through, she would keep terrorizing families indefinitely. So I doubled down. I gathered statements from those neighbors, added them to my growing file, and prepared for the storm I knew was coming, because Karen was cornered. And a cornered bully is the most dangerous kind. The next board meeting was only a week away, and I had no doubt she would use it to try and rally the last of her supporters against me. But what she didn't know was that I was walking in with more truth, more evidence, and more allies than she could possibly expect. And for the first time, I felt like the tide might be turning. Though I also knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, and if her history taught me anything, her next move would be explosive. The days after the explosive HOA meeting felt strangely calm at first. Almost like the eye of a storm, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak now waved at me openly. some even stopping by to thank me for standing up to Karen, and petitions quietly circulated calling for her removal from the board. It should have felt like a victory, but in my gut I knew it was too soon to celebrate. Because Karen was not the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was plotting something, and sure enough, it didn't take long for her retaliation to arrive. One morning I walked out to head to work and found a bright red notice taped to my front door in giant bold letters that read, "Final warning, foreclosure action imminent." My heart skipped a beat until I read the fine print and realized it was another one of Karen's fabrications. The document wasn't legally binding. It was just another scare tactic, but the brazenness of it made my blood boil. I snapped a photo and added it to my growing folder of evidence. But later that afternoon, the real shock came when I received a letter in the mail from a local attorney's office. Apparently, Karen had actually hired a lawyer to send me a demand letter, claiming I owed over $2,500 in outstanding contributions, and threatening legal action if I didn't pay within 10 days. The letter was on real letterhead, which made it more intimidating than her homemade notices. But when I showed it to my own attorney, he smirked and said, "This is fluff, nothing enforceable." But it shows she's desperate enough to waste money trying to scare you. His advice was to hold firm, keep documenting, and let her dig her own hole deeper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being under siege. It wasn't just paper. Harassment anymore? One night I came home to find raw eggs splattered across my garage door. Another morning I discovered tire tracks across my lawn like someone had deliberately driven over it. Neighbors whispered that Karen was telling people I was a criminal freeloading off the community. And when I went to the grocery store, one of her friends sneered at me, muttering loud enough for me to hear that people like me drag everyone else down. It was exhausting, the constant pressure, the need to be on guard every moment. And yet I refused to give in, because if I gave her an inch, she'd take a mile. So I pressed forward with my complaint, submitting more evidence to the county office and even sharing some of it with local law enforcement. Then came the breaking point. Late one Friday night, I was sitting in my living room when red and blue lights flashed outside my window again. My stomach dropped as I opened the door to find officers once more. They told me Karen had called 911, claiming I was brandishing a weapon and threatening neighbors. My blood ran cold, because this wasn't just harassment anymore. It was dangerous. If those officers had come in expecting an armed suspect, things could have gone very badly for me. I calmly explained the situation, showed them the folder of evidence again, and one of the officers sighed, shaking his head, saying it was clear they were dealing with a false reporter. But hearing that didn't make the adrenaline in my veins subside. I realized Karen wasn't just trying to ruin my reputation or my finances. She was now playing with my freedom, even my safety. It's one wrong move during one of her false 911 calls, and my life could be shattered. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with scenarios. And by morning, I knew I had no choice but to escalate further. My attorney agreed it was time to file a restraining order, not just a complaint, but a formal legal barrier to stop her from contacting me or abusing emergency services against me. We began the paperwork, gathering every report, every photo, every bogus notice, and even witness statements from neighbors who had seen her harassment firsthand. As the days ticked by, Karen seemed to sense I was making a move. She paced her driveway more often, glaring at me whenever I stepped outside. And though her friends tried to back her up, the whispers in the neighborhood were shifting. People were tired of her games, tired of the fear, and I knew when the restraining order was filed, it would change everything. I also knew it would push Karen into a corner, and a cornered Karen was more dangerous than ever. Still, I had made my choice. I was done being her target, done being her scapegoat. It was time to take the fight out of her hands and put it squarely in the hands of the law, even if it meant the final showdown was going to be uglier than anything I had faced so far. The day the restraining order hearing arrived felt like the culmination of months of pressure, anxiety, and constant vigilance. I walked into the county courthouse clutching a thick binder filled with every shred of evidence I had collected, my lawyer by my side reassuring me that we had more than enough to prove a pattern of harassment. Across the aisle sat Karen in her usual self-righteous posture, chin lifted, lips pursed, clutching a stack of papers she clearly thought would vindicate her. Her eyes locked onto mine with a glare that could have cut steel. and behind her sat two of her loyal HOA board members, their arms crossed in solidarity. As though this was their battle too, the judge entered. Stern woman who wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. She asked Karen directly about the multiple 911 calls she had made. Karen launched into a dramatic speech about me being a danger to the community and a lawbreaker refusing to contribute to neighborhood upkeep. She waved papers in the air, but when the judge asked to see them, it turned out they were nothing more than HOA newsletters and self-written invoices, demanding payment for her personal expenses thinly disguised as community charges. My lawyer calmly pointed out that none of them had legal authority. None. Were signed by legitimate auditors, and all lacked the proper documentation required by state statutes. Then came the 911 call records, each one presented in black and white, the times, the dates, the false accusations. One officer had even submitted a statement explaining that Karen's reports were unfounded and appeared retaliatory. I watched the judge's expression tighten as she flipped through them. Karen fidgeted, her bravado cracking as the truth came to light when it was my turn to speak. I explained calmly but firmly how her harassment had escalated, how it had moved from phony fines to vandalism to public defamation, and now 2 dangerous false emergency calls that could have gotten me killed. I laid out how she attempted to saddle me with her own bills by hiding them under fabricated HOA charges, and how she used her power position to intimidate anyone who dared to question her by the time I finished. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of the judge's pen. She looked up at Karen and said in a voice that carried finality, "This behavior is not only a violation of homeowner rights, it is unlawful. It borders on criminal misuse of emergency services." Karen's face flushed deep red. She tried to interject, stammering something about me being a manipulator, but the judge shut her down, saying the evidence spoke for itself. In that moment, I felt a wave of relief I hadn't known in months, and yet there was also a gnawing awareness that Karen wasn't someone who would simply accept defeat. Still, the ruling was handed down, the restraining order was granted. Karen was barred from contacting me directly, barred from stepping onto my property, and barred from filing any further claims against me without going through the court first. It was a resounding legal victory, but in the back of my mind, I could feel the tension, like a storm cloud still lingering because people like Karen didn't just stop. They obsessed, they schemed, and I had the distinct feeling she would try to claw back whatever power she thought had been stripped from her. Sure enough, the aftermath proved me right. Though she could no longer harass me directly, she began spreading her poison through whispers and proxy actions. The 2 board members who had shown up with her at court began sending out newsletters filled with veiled insults, hinting at irresponsible residents dragging down the community. Some neighbors avoided me, not because they believed her, but because they feared being her next target. And one evening, as I walked to my mailbox, I caught Karen staring from her window, her expression twisted not with defeat but with simmering rage, like a kettle left boiling. She wasn't finished. She was waiting, and I knew it, so I doubled down on protecting myself, installing cameras, keeping every interaction documented, and reminding myself that no matter what she tried next, the law was finally on my side. But deep down, I also braced for the inevitable. Because Karen's next move was coming, and judging by the way she carried herself, it was going to be bigger, louder, and more reckless than anything she had dared. Before, the restraining order had cornered her, and cornered people like Karen didn't just fade quietly into the background. They lashed out, and when she did, I had to be ready. Because this wasn't just about HOA drama anymore. It was about proving once and for all that no matter how loud, no matter how manipulative, no matter how ruthless, she could not twist the law into her personal weapon forever. And the next clash would determine not just the end of her reign, but the peace of the entire neighborhood. The night before the next HOA board meeting, I barely slept, pacing my living room with my folder of evidence stacked neatly on the coffee table, running through every possible scenario in my head, because I knew Karen wouldn't hold back, and if I wasn't prepared to counter every accusation she threw at me, she might manage to sway enough people to keep her grip on the neighborhood. By the time I walked into the community clubhouse the following evening, the tension was so thick. It was like walking into a courtroom. Neighbors filled the rows of folding chairs, some whispering, some glaring, and at the head of the table, there was Karen, dressed in her usual prim cardigan and pearls, lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She opened the meeting with her usual pomp, rattling off neighborhood updates, then launched, almost immediately into her attack, declaring that certain members were deliberately refusing to pay what was owed, jeopardizing the HOA's finances and endangering the community's reputation of excellence. Her words dripped with venom, and though she didn't name me outright, her gaze burned into me with every sentence. I waited for her to finish, then calmly stood, pulling out my stack of papers, my voice steady as I began. I'd like to respond to these claims with some facts. I laid out everything, piece by piece, starting with the ridiculous notice demanding I pay for her landscaping and pool cleaning, followed by the bogus violation slips, the doctored letters threatening liens. Even the harassment incidents that I had reported to the police, I could feel the room shifting as neighbors leaned forward, eyes widening at the pile of evidence growing on the table in front of me. Whispers spread like wildfire, and for the first time, Karen's smug smile faltered. She tried to interrupt, claiming I was misrepresenting her actions, but this time, the other board members held up their hands, telling her to let me finish. And when I read aloud a statement from another resident, describing how Karen had fined them $100 for having the wrong shade of curtains, the room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. The cracks in her armor were showing. Still, Karen wasn't one to admit defeat, so she slammed her hand on the table and shouted, "He's lying. He's trying to destroy this community. He's the real problem here." But the more hysterical she became, the calmer I stayed, answering every accusation with documentation, and the more neighbors started speaking up. "She'll fine me for a flower pot," one woman blurted. She threatened to tow my car for parking in my own driveway, another man added. Suddenly it wasn't just me standing up to Karen anymore. It was a chorus of frustrated voices. And Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority began to crumble. She turned red, sputtering, insisting the rules were for everyone's benefit, but no one was buying it anymore. One board member leaned toward her and whispered something that made her eyes widen with panic. And I realized she was losing control of the very board she thought she owned. I ended my presentation by saying, "This is not about community. This is about abuse of power, and it has to stop." The room went quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that comes before a shift. And then, slowly, people began clapping, softly at first, then louder, until it filled the clubhouse. Karen looked around in disbelief, like she couldn't process what was happening, her power unraveling in front of her. But even as the tide turned, I knew she wouldn't accept it quietly. And sure enough, after the meeting ended, as people filtered out and murmured about forming a petition to remove her from the board, Karen stormed up to me in the parking lot, her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I will bury you." Her voice shook with fury. But before I could respond, another neighbor walked up, recording everything on their phone, and Karen realized she'd been caught making threats. She spun on her heel and stormed off to her car, peeling out of the parking lot so fast, she nearly clipped a curb. I stood there watching her taillights disappear, my heart pounding, because while the meeting had been a victory, it was only one battle in a war that was far from over. I had embarrassed Karen in front of her followers, exposed her lies, and weakened her grip on the HOA. But that also meant she would come back harder, angrier, and more reckless than ever. And I had no illusions that she would stop at harassment notices or angry phone calls. No, Karen was desperate. Now, and desperate people do dangerous things. As I drove home that night, the victory felt hollow, because deep down, I knew the storm was only beginning, and I would have to be ready for whatever chaos Karen unleashed next.